Amount on a card, Mr. Chair. On a, Mr. Chair.
Dr. Rajan Prasad.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Finally, indeed, Mr. Chair recognises me. Mr. Chair.
Oh, no, that's unfair. But you might not next time.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do apologise for that comment. I know I'm a bit hard to recognise in this side of the House. Mr. Chair, I would always support, and I say this to the Minister as well, well thought out social policy. Social policy that's gone through a good process, and it actually does make sense. It's supported by a whole lot of evidence, and it's brought to the House. Whenever, in the two terms I've been in this House, whenever the government has brought bills like that in the social development area around children, this side has always supported those bills. But on this occasion we're not. And I simply ask the Minister to consider, and indeed the Speaker's opposite, to consider why would it be that this side of the House would be so hostile to provisions like this. It's not because we're silly. It's because these proposals are silly, and it's because these proposals are not well thought out. They're driven by something else, and they're driven by a particular ideology. And I want to come back to that as well. Clearly the officials have been given particular policy outcomes, and I acknowledge the officials here that worked very hard with us in the Select Committee, and that's what's driving this. But it's not the logic of the proposals, logic of what we ought to be doing in New Zealand if this is an issue. It's just simply driven by a set of ideological statements which really are about welfare dependency. So what has been the government's approach that is shown in the provisions in Part 1? Clearly, think through a whole series of difficulties, set up a welfare working group, get them to identify, create, it's their own creation, welfare dependency, and then begin to drive the particular ideology that the government started with in the provisions of Part 1 and particularly Part 1 and 3 of this bill. So, and that's been the government's approach in this particular bill. The government says the government also has an intellectually dishonest approach to what they've been saying. And the chairman of the Select Committee, Sam Lotaringas, indeed used that a little while ago. First, you start with the large number, 339,000 people who are either on welfare or whose children, or children who live in welfare-dependent homes. That's where you start with. So you create in the country this notion that here we have this huge problem, and then drive this kind of process through it. But how many people, the proposals that are in this bill, how many people does it affect? And I've taken the officials' own figures. It comes to about 31,948. So it's not exactly something that's going to alter the development pathway for a whole bunch of people. But somehow what the government wants to do is to create this notion that here we are addressing welfare dependency. The next place where we saw that is the way the whole bill has been handled. It's been one of the most rushed processes one can imagine. I mean, this is not a bill that was well thought out in the Select Committee. Our submitters, Mr. Chairman, did not support the provisions of Part 1 of this bill. And they didn't. And yet it was rushed through. The Minister would not allow Select Committee to have a decent period. What was their argument, Mr. Chairman? The argument was when the Welfare Working Group reported, the country had its say, and therefore it now does not need to have its say. That also is intellectually dishonest. It's taking our people for a ride, and that's because the government wants to drive this particular ideology through in a way that the Minister believes is the right way of doing things. So the rhetoric then that the Minister uses here is change is on the way. Bravado and rhetoric of that type simply is that, but in the end does not achieve fundamental change. The belief the Minister is saying is that this will achieve fundamental change. It won't. It really won't. It will give this impression that a lot is being done, welfare dependency will be throttled and everything else will be okay. Well, it wouldn't be. And in the provisions of Part 1 that actually looks at the... Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Rajan Prasad.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Oh, things are looking up already. Thank you.
Brighter future under Nash.
I knew I needed to speak at this time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You're so wonderful. This is called banking. You're going to bank for your future. But when we look at the provisions around the attitude to young people that Part 1 reflects, it actually is a negative, punitive attitude. But it's now being shaped by the minister as if this is this new thing that we're going to let the agencies out there that know more about this than anybody else work with these young people, and it will be all hunky-dory at the end. Well, it won't be, because this is, a rather curious way of shifting resources into the private sector as well, and letting them provide. Now, many of these young people who are in the 16 to 17 age category, many of them actually have come out of child, youth and family. They were in care. They are quite vulnerable people. The state, in a sense, has not done very well with some of these kids. But what do? We apply in the provisions of Part 1 this punitive approach a little bit further. So the assumption, the presumption is that these young people can't manage themselves. That's the starting point of this government and this bill and the provisions of Part 1. Attitudes to young people. That these young people, let's not give them a chance to show us what they can do, but let's start with a presumption that they will waste their money, that they will not care for themselves, and so we build around this, and Part 1 does this, these quite draconian provisions. And I personally object to them because the young people I know actually do have the ability to be, when trusted and guided, to do very, very well. But this one does it the other way around. Young people have to earn the respect of some NGO sector out there, or some social worker, or some service provider. Oh, you're now good enough to manage your own resources. You're now good enough to have the little bit of money that you're entitled to get. So I think that's a curious approach. It's an anti-young people approach, and I want to know from the minister, where is the science that says that this is the way young people operate? Which is the theory? What is the research that says this will work? The minister talks a lot about being evidence-based. Well, this is not evidence-based. This is the ideology-based, and this is based on a punitive approach. We will show somebody else out there that we are taking a tough approach. And that's what bothers us about this particular way that the government is doing things. The minister shakes her head, but the minister can couch it any way she likes, and you can criticize us by saying, you don't care, you don't know, and the minister is the only one that does. Sorry, I'm talking about myself here. But in fact, the science is not there, Minister. The young people, all of the theory I know, all of the research I know, and much of the experience I know, says, you work with young people, you take them along, and not start by saying, no, you're not going to get any control, but only when you're good, we'll give you some control. And I think that it's some kind of crazy reverse psychology that doesn't make sense at all. And I think that's a fundamental flaw in this area. Now, we know, Mr. Speaker, that, Mr. Chairman, this side has the experience of reducing people on benefits through triaging to the same work and income that's there today, triaging very early on. They got people into work and had the lowest unemployment rate in the world. So the science is in that particular ministry right now. Given the space to do it, they know how to do it. But if given a policy direction that says, you've got to apply this approach based on welfare dependency, then I think we've created a problem and now we're trying to fix it. And what are the chances of that working? Very, very little. I want to just come back to ask the minister to have a bit more thought around the young people who've been in child, youth and family care themselves, are now in independent youth benefits, they have been, and now will be caught by this particular program. I mean, these are people who need to be trusted, who need to be taken very carefully by the hand and enabled to make something of themselves. But starting from the rhetoric of welfare dependency, Mr. Chairman, will not get us there.
Chairman. Senate Lolly Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.